This conference will now be recorded.
All right. Well, as I said, good evening. What you should be able to see on the screen right now is just a brief agenda of what we're going to do for this meeting. I have no idea if it's going to take us the full 3 hours or not. Sometimes these meetings do last 3 hours and sometimes they are quite a bit shorter. So it all depends on the amount of material to cover and the number of questions that students have. Let's see, the first thing I want to do then is just do an overview of Module 1 assignments. So I'm going to minimize that and go to Learning Modules. Right now I'm in my view, so I'm going to switch to Student View, so we'll be kind of having the same view. Okay, so there's our Module 1. All right, so as you can see, you had 4 things to read for this module. The first article that you had to read was basically the very first chapter, not really a chapter in the textbook, and it was an EBP exemplar, provided a good example of the steps in the evidence-based practice process, and hopefully gave you some idea of what you're going to be expected to do going forward regarding the graduate project, except that you won't actually be implementing that project. You will just be developing a proposal that is implementable. And then the first 2 chapters of the textbook we read, basically the first one was an overview of the importance of evidence-based practice, and went through the steps of the evidence-based practice process. And then chapter 2 got into stating PICO questions and the purpose of those questions, and also some other concepts like background evidence and foreground evidence and different types of questions, EBP questions, research questions, QI questions, that sort of thing. And my intent with the presentation tonight will be to go over the high points of those 2 chapters in the textbook, and then I've also incorporated some information from this very brief article that was just published in 2019 by Gallagher, Ford, and Melnick. And it is just a little bit more information about writing PICO questions. Okay, so then the presentation, again, as I said, is just going to be the high points of this chapter 1 and chapter 2 of the textbook. And I will be recording that for later viewing. Another thing you were supposed to do for this module was do that optional online meeting availability survey. And based on that survey, I was able to identify some times during the week when the most students would possibly be available for online meetings, so that I could schedule these optional meetings during a time when the most students who would actually want to attend synchronously would be able to do so. And with that information, then I revised the course schedule today and posted a new course schedule that shows when the online meetings are planned throughout the semester. And you'll notice that instead of those being from 5 to 8 p.m., I've scheduled them from 4 to 7 p.m. because it appeared that the most number of students were actually available from 4 to 6 p.m. After 7, it kind of, or I'm sorry, after 6 p.m. it drops off a bit, but I figured if people could at least attend for the first 2 hours, then they would get the most benefit out of it and be able to watch the last hour on the recording. Okay, and then you have just one discussion activity for this module, basically that involves addressing the module objectives. And then the initial response for that discussion activity was due Sunday, and then your replies for that activity will be due on the 26th, as will be your contributions to the Module 1 wiki, which is going to consist of posting 3 potential PICO questions that you might be able to work with throughout the rest of the term. Okay, so the instructions then were provided here for the Module 1 discussion. And then to view the wiki instructions, you had to actually go to the wiki. And let's just go there and see if anybody's been posting. And it looks like a few people have been posting in the wiki. You can see that I created three rows for each student so that you could then just type in this table. And before you actually edit the table, you have to click on Edit Wiki Content. And before you do that, I recommend reading the instructions up here. I also included the definition of a wiki in case you weren't familiar with wikis. I just started using wikis last semester, so the definition is really probably more for me than you folks, because you may or may not have used them before. Okay, so that is what I wanted to show regarding Module 1. Let's just see. We talked about discussion, the wiki, and then some announcements and reminders. I already mentioned that I updated the course schedule to include the dates of the online meetings, and they don't necessarily occur every other week. I have a couple of conferences I have to go to during the semester, plus spring break for me is a little off because I'm going to be taking it the end of February, the first week in March, whereas spring break is actually the week of the 16th of March. So I'll be working that week while everyone else is on spring break, but I wasn't going to be available prior to that for any online meetings. So that's one reason that the online meetings aren't just sort of regularly scheduled throughout the semester. I wanted to mention citation of textbook chapters, and in particular, I'm referring to discussion postings. You're asked in your discussion postings to support the claims that you make and the feedback that you give to your classmates using information from assigned readings. And I wanted to point out that you need to cite the textbook chapter, not the full textbook. And the reason I say that is because the textbook, or anytime you're working with an edited textbook, okay, it's going to be edited by a couple of people or maybe one person. In this case, your textbook is edited by Bernadette Mazurek Melnick and Ellen Fineau Overholt. However, these two ladies did not write every chapter in the textbook. You'll notice if you go into Unit 1, go to Chapter 1, the authors of this chapter are Melnick and Fineau Overholt, whereas if we go to Chapter 2, the authors are Fineau Overholt and Stillwell. Okay, so the information that comes out of a chapter that you include in a discussion post needs to be credited to the people who wrote the chapter, not the people who edited the textbook. And I bring this up because that was one of the most common citation errors that occurred in previous semesters, and it would detract from your scholarship points when it comes down to grading those. So I just wanted to point that out so you could avoid that problem. And go back to our agenda. Then I also did just want to point out the scholarship and reliability rubrics and make sure everyone understands how that works, because that also sometimes can be a problem for students. And I'm going to have to exit preview mode to do that. Just going to find my rubrics. Okay, I don't know if you had time, well, theoretically you're supposed to have read the syllabus, and you will have noticed that you will get points for participation reliability with each module. And generally that works out to be in like 2-week increments. It depends on the module, but the total number of points you earn for reliability is not added into the configuration of the final course grade. It's the average of those points. So let's say, for instance, if there's 6 modules and you had a potential of earning 10 reliability points for each module, at the end of the semester, or actually at midterm 2, I will average those. And if you've gotten 10 reliability points for every module, then your average is going to be 10. And so that you'll get 10 reliability points contributing to your final course grade. Now, substance is a little different. I'm going to randomly select 2 discussions to grade for substance this semester, and you won't know which ones those are going to be. I'll randomly select one from the first half of the semester and one from the second half of the semester. Once they're selected, I'll let you know what they are, but you won't. They will be finished by the time that happens. And the reason that I'm doing this random selection is to encourage people to do a good job on every discussion and not just the one that they think I'm going to grade. So with that, I just wanted to bring up, first I'll bring up the reliability rubric. And you should be able to access this, should be attached to each module discussion. You should be able to see it in the gradebook each time I've added the new columns in the gradebook. And you can see that you get credit for quantity, which basically means that you posted what you were supposed to post, and timeliness, that you did it on time. Okay, so, and that's, I think it's self-explanatory if you read across there. So in other words, if you post something after the deadline, you're probably going to lose some points for timeliness, or if you missed a reply or something like that, you might lose a point for quantity. And then the substance rubric. There's a little more to it, a little more substance to the substance rubric. I explained at the top how the points are awarded. And basically this, you get points for the content of your postings, how well they're written, and then the same thing for replies. You get, you'll get points for how well or how good the content is of your reply and how well it's written. And then for scholarship, basically that relates to making sure that you support your claims with citation of the sources where you got those claims. All right, and I know sometimes students think, well, that idea came out of my head and that's why I didn't cite it. But if you make a claim that is not common knowledge, and you should back it up with a citation of a source. And just a rule of thumb is that very little of that knowledge that lives in your head or in your brain is going to be considered common knowledge. So when in doubt, it's better to cite a source than to not cite the source and assume that it's common knowledge. So any questions so far?
Nope.
Okay. All right, I will close that one.
I had a quick question.
Go ahead.
Okay, so for the first discussion post, is it okay if we didn't cite the actual chapters? I didn't know that, so I didn't do that, but I just cited, you know, the book.
Well, you will get, I mean, if you did that, if you just credited the book and you didn't, then you're not really crediting the authors of the chapter. Okay, so I guess what I would do at this point is go back and reply to your own posting and make a correction to that.
Okay. Okay.
This is not, I mean, this is, I'm not like making this up for the purposes of the class. This is just the way it is. And
okay.
so it's not a rule for the class. This is just a general rule that maybe no one's ever pointed out to you before.
Okay.
Any other questions? All right. Okay, so we went over scholarship. Oh, email. I'm going to talk about email. Allen College has a policy that students are to communicate with Allen College and with their professors using their Allen College email account. And I know a lot of students will have their Allen College email forwarded to like a Gmail account or a Hotmail account or a Yahoo account, or just a personal email account. And then they'll also reply to their professors from that account. Well, what happens then is that the email comes to the professor with the warning message that it's from an outside sender. that it could be spam or phishing. And if we don't recognize your name in the account, like it's like hotpants@yahoo.com or something like that, I don't know who that is, and I may just delete that. So I am gonna enforce that rule this semester, that any email, this is also in the syllabus and in the information in the Start Here area of the course, any email that you send to me needs to come from your Allen College email account. So I guess my recommendation would be that just get in the habit of checking your Allen College email and conducting your school email business from that account, reserving your personal account for only your personal business. And I've got probably 3 or 4 email accounts that I check, and and that's one of the reasons, so that the people I'm sending the email to that have that account will know that it's coming from an internal sender and not an external account. So that's something to keep in mind. And the first time that if I get an email from you and it comes from your outside or your personal email account, I may go ahead and read it, but and then remind you that please to communicate with me through your Allen College email account, because it is a college policy. But after that, I may not do that. So just keep that in mind going forward. Get in the habit of checking your Allen College email account. Another good reason to do that is that from time to time, you'll be asked to change your password on your Allen College email account. And if all your email is being forwarded to your personal email account and you're never checking your Allen College email account, you may not know that that password has expired. And then once it's expired, it becomes a really big hassle to get it changed. You have to like work with IT to get it changed. This way you'll know that it's expiring and you can act on it before it actually expires and save yourself some trouble that way. Okay, so questions about email. All right, well, with that, then I'm going to go ahead and go into the presentation that's going to cover the readings, the assigned readings, except for the EBP exemplar that preceded chapter 1. I did not include that in my presentation. I'm going to go ahead and okay. All right, so module 1 is basically, the main point of module 1 is about crafting PICO questions, because you're going to operate from one PICO question at some point in the course to do all the rest of the assignments. Okay, so we have there's 8 objectives here, and they're not terribly detailed objectives. In fact, there's probably a little overlap between them, but I'm going to go through the content that addresses each of these objectives as I go through this presentation this evening. Okay, and I know that in your undergraduate education, you would have probably taken a course in introductory nursing research and evidence-based practice. So I'm confident that everybody has a good idea of what evidence-based practice is, but just as a starting point, I'm defining it here, and it's use of the best available evidence to answer practice questions and to guide practice. And Melnick and Final-Overholt emphasize in chapter 1 that you need evidence combined with clinical expertise and judgment and client preferences and values to actually achieve evidence-based practice. So you can't just rely on evidence. You have to also weigh that evidence against your clinical expertise and judgment and what the client wants to do in order to really practice evidence-based practice. And this next slide is just directly from your textbook. It's just a model showing the things that contribute, or the components that contribute to evidence-based clinical decision-making. And again, you've got evidence, and here it mentions internal evidence and then clinical expertise and patient preferences. And later on, we'll differentiate internal evidence from external evidence. Okay. So why is evidence-based practice relevant at this point in your education if you've already covered it as an undergraduate nurse? Well, it's because you are one of the culminating events of your education is going to be the MSN project. Okay, and that project is going to be implementation of, or I'm sorry, it's going to be the design of a project that you could actually implement. You won't actually have to implement it, but it's going to be an evidence-based practice quality improvement project. And the other important point is that the American Association of Colleges of Nursing that accredits our program specifies what master's education must include. And it has, I think there are like 8, maybe 10 essentials. And 3 of those essentials relate directly to doing evidence-based practice. And I'm going to just exit the slideshow for a second just to show those. Okay, so this document that you're looking at on the screen right now is the essentials of master's education in nursing. And it's getting a little bit dated, and I'm expecting that they're probably going to update this pretty soon because it's pushing 10 years old. But if we scroll down and look at the actual essentials, you can see essential 1 is this class supports this because you need to have a background for practice that is based on science and humanities. I won't read this to you here, but you can see that what the expectation is or the definition is of that essential. Basically, you need to be able to recognize and use evidence and information from the sciences and humanities. And then quality improvement and safety. We want master's prepared nurses to be able to conduct those sorts of activities in the institutions where they work. And then number 4, translating and integrating scholarship into practice. This is essentially, you can paraphrase that as being able to locate evidence, existing evidence, and apply that or translate it into your own practice to achieve the best possible client outcomes. So those are, let's see how many actually essentials are. It looks like there are actually 9 essentials. So, and you can see a third of those relate to this class and one of the outcomes that we want you to achieve in the Masters of Science in Nursing program at Allen College. Okay, and I'm just going to return to the presentation. Oh, I accidentally started from the beginning. Okay, so now we're back to where we were. And here I have just included a couple of pieces of information directly from the MSN Graduate Project Manual, which you will become intimately acquainted with when you take Evidence-Based Practice 2 NU536, maybe next semester or in the fall perhaps. But this basically is the gist of the project. It's going to entail designing an evidence-based practice change to address a genuine practice problem that is a priority in a real project setting. And then the reason that we have you do this is because it gives you the opportunity to experience planning, designing an evidence-based quality improvement project, and gives you the chance to demonstrate integration of knowledge gained throughout the MSN program of study. So with those things in mind, I want you to keep those points in mind as you're coming up with PICO questions this semester, early in the semester, because the work you do in this class could actually give you a leg up going into the next class when you're actually designing the MSN project proposal. So, you know, a lot of the literature research you do and the critical appraisal of the sources of evidence that you find and the synthesis of that evidence, if your PICO question addresses a real practice problem in a real project setting, perhaps where you work right now, then you could perhaps save yourself some time moving into the next course because you'll have some of that preliminary work done in this class. Now, this is the second semester that this class has been taught, and so I don't really have any feel yet for how students came out the first semester in terms of being able to continue working with the PICO question that they worked with during NU535 Evidence-Based Practice 1. But I want you to, keep it in mind that that is an option. You certainly don't have to choose the PICO question and the practice problem that you're going to go on to work with to create your graduate project proposal. But if that's something that you can do, I would recommend it, because I think that you will be less overwhelmed and in better shape once you take evidence-based practice 2 if you have a solid PICO question that you can actually use to design an evidence-based practice quality improvement project for your MSN project. Okay, so now I'm just gonna move into the first objective and review those 7 steps in the EBP process. And we're only gonna cover basically like 4 of them in this class, and the rest of them, well, and some of them you won't cover because you won't actually implement the project, but you'll focus on the other half of the process in the next EBP course, Evidence-Based Practice 2. So here's just a list of the 7 steps. They start with step 0, which is cultivate a spirit of inquiry in the environment, and end with the 6, which is disseminate the outcomes of the evidence-based change. And then I'm just going to briefly define each of those as we move on in here. Here's kind of a helpful diagram that appears in the textbook on page 23, outlining step 0 and how you progress through the steps. And we are going to get this far this semester. We're going to get to step 3. And then in the next class, you might have to repeat these steps if you have to start fresh with a new PICO question, but you will get to the point where you actually draft the proposal in the next class so that you can move forward with it and complete the project in the semester following evidence-based practice 2. Okay, so that spirit of inquiry basically just is interest. You become interested in something you've observed in the practice setting, the place where you work, and it inspires you to do something about that problem. Now, not every place that people work supports that spirit of inquiry. So it's important that your culture or the environment that you work in supports the culture of EBP, or you're not going to get very far in doing something about the problems that you identify. It's important that people in the environment have evidence-based practice competence, and that's one of the things that we're working on this semester, is developing competence in writing PICO questions and building search strategies in searching for evidence, finding and obtaining that evidence, reading it, critically appraising it, and synthesizing it. Those are competencies that are important to have in order to support evidence-based practice in a particular clinical setting. There's also the need for tools. The main tool I can think of is having access to electronic databases and a reference librarian to help you build your search strategy and to help you actually execute that search strategy using electronic databases. At Allen College, we have a reference librarian, and we also have several electronic databases that you can access. But I would encourage you, if you work at a major medical center, I bet it also has a medical library or a reference library with a competent reference librarian who could assist you with the assignments that you have to do in this class. And in particular, I'm referring to building your search strategy. It's really important to get assistance from a librarian to do that. But the other thing is that the organization environment needs to recognize efforts to conduct evidence-based practice. They need to support that spirit of inquiry all the way from identifying the problem to doing something about it and disseminating the findings. Okay, so after step 0, after you've kind of gotten this inspiration to explore a solution to a problem, you need to format a PICO question or formulate a PICO question. PICO question's got several components, the P and I. Patient population is the P, intervention or issue is the I, comparison, intervention, or group is the C. Then you've got the outcome and T for a time frame. Okay. And the next step is you're going to search for the best evidence. Okay, and you're going to use that PICO question to provide you with the key words to build your search strategy. And this is, again, where the reference librarian comes in and is so important, because they can help you take a well-written PICO question and conduct a efficient, productive search strategy. So, and when we refer to this sort of a search, it's referred to as a systematic search for evidence to identify the most relevant and the best evidence. Okay. And now there's going to be different levels or types of evidence for different types of PICO questions, and I'll cover that briefly a little later in this presentation. Step 3 then is you're going to critically appraise the evidence. So once you've searched for and found the evidence, then you have to start reading it and critically appraising it. You have to determine if the results are valid, meaning are they true? Are they close to the truth as possible? Did the researchers use good study methods to come up with the findings that are going to serve as your evidence? One example is that in a trial of an intervention or a treatment, it would be important to determine whether the patients were randomly assigned to the treatment or control groups, and whether they were equal or equivalent on key characteristics prior to the treatment. And so that's important. Validity, I was just talking about validity and I didn't have the bullet point up. The next component that you're looking for when you critically appraise evidence is reliability. What are the results? You want to, what did the researchers find? And for example, in an intervention trial, the results include whether the intervention worked. Did it produce the desired effect or outcome in the patients who received it, whereas the patients who did not receive it did not experience that desired change in the outcome. Let's see, and then applicability is an important feature of critical appraisal. Do the results apply in your particular practice setting? Were the patients or the participants that participated in the studies represented in the evidence that you have? Are your patients similar to them? Are they a similar population? So those are some things to consider with critical appraisal. And we'll actually spend a whole module on critically appraising the evidence. So we will be thoroughly exploring these 3 aspects of critical appraisal. Okay. In step 4, you need to integrate the evidence with expertise, patient and family preferences. And these are things that if you were actually going to implement your project, you would actually have to do with the proposal. You'll just be planning for how that would be done. Okay. The clinical expertise simply refers to the knowledge of the population and the problem or issue, what resources are available to implement the practice change, and the experience and competence of the people involved in the EBP process. And then patient family preferences simply refer to what does the patient want? Does the patient have enough information to make an informed decision about accepting treatment or declining it, and whether or not that's appropriate for them. Okay, then you evaluate the outcomes, and you're going to plan in your MSN project proposal how you would evaluate the outcomes. So you'd have to write down to the very details of how you would do statistical calculations. That's something that you can look forward to when you take evidence-based practice 2. So, but essentially you're looking for whether or not the evidence-based change led to the desired outcomes. And so it's going to require data collection. So you're going to plan for how you would collect data, and you'll be creating internal evidence. And then again, I mentioned before, one of our objectives is to differentiate between internal and external evidence. We'll be doing that later on in the presentation. Evaluating outcomes might involve comparing outcomes to external indicators, such as benchmarking data. And then you have to decide based on your evaluation of outcomes if the practice change should be continued given the outcomes. Then lastly, you're going to disseminate. Okay, and this could be in the form of a conference presentation, either a poster or speaking, giving an oral presentation, or you might write a journal article. Now, obviously, you don't really have anything, you don't have any outcomes to disseminate if you're not actually implementing the project. But at Allen College, once you've completed your project, you will present it to your peers at presentations probably the week before. I'm sorry, I back up. I was going to say the week before graduation, but that's not true anymore, because you can actually present your project now once you've gone through all the steps in the semester where you finish the steps. So you may not be graduating until a later semester, but we consider that dissemination. You'll also be disseminating the project, and by dissemination, I mean presenting your proposal to the stakeholders in the setting where you would implement it if you were actually required to do so. And that way you can get feedback from those stakeholders regarding the project design and implementation and measurement of outcomes, so that you could make modifications to it. So you'll actually do 2 dissemination events throughout the graduate project process. You'll disseminate once to your stakeholders, and then you'll disseminate again to your peers, your classmates, and to faculty at the very end of the semester when you have actually completed all your project steps. Okay, questions so far? All right, let's see, what time is it? 5:38, we're doing okay. I try to take a break at like every 45, 50 minutes, so we will do that in about 10 more minutes here. Okay, so the next module objective is to differentiate evidence-based practice from research and quality improvement. And I just kind of compiled a table here to do that for you. The main difference, if you look at this table, between evidence-based practice and quality improvement is that evidence-based practice involves a systematic search for external evidence, and then decisions are made based on that evidence. Whereas with QI, you're basically working internally. You're identifying a problem or a process that's not functioning well, and then you change that process and then collect data to evaluate the outcomes of that change. Now, the combination of EBP QI includes both the systematic decision-making process to answer a PICO question, as well as QI activities. You can see that the main difference between research, EBP QI, and the combination of the two is that research findings are generalizable given certain circumstances. Research generates new knowledge, whereas evidence-based practice works with existing knowledge to make a change in practice. And then another major difference between these 4 types of activities is that research generally always has to go through an institutional review board to ensure the privacy and safety of human subjects. But that may not be the case for these other activities depending on the institution. Now at Allen College, our DNP students are required to implement their evidence-based practice quality improvement projects, and those have to go through the institutional review board to ensure that the privacy of patient data that's collected is not breached. So that's the main reason they go through. And we have a special EBP QI review process for those projects that's separate from the process that we use to review research proposals. Okay. So then objective 3 is to differentiate external evidence from internal evidence. I've mentioned those terms a couple times. Basically, internal evidence is evidence that's generated within an organization. It's like quality improvement data, whereas external evidence is evidence generated and published outside the organization, like research evidence. Okay, but it's all evidence. Evidence includes a lot of things. It used to be early in the evidence-based practice movement, the only things that were considered evidence were findings from randomized controlled trials and systematic reviews of randomized controlled trials. But that definition has expanded to include even expert opinion, could be qualitative data. There's all kinds of evidence, and you'll be exposed to that or have your memory refreshed about it when we get into a future module. Okay, so external evidence then, here are some examples. It's evidence that's generated through rigorous research. That could include systematic reviews, evidence-based theories, national benchmarking data, such as data from healthypeople.gov, the AHRQ quality indicators, National Public Health Performance Standards, and the National Quality Forum. And also opinion leaders and expert panels provide external evidence. Okay. Internal evidence then is the evidence that's generated within an organization through practice initiatives such as outcomes management, quality improvement projects, EBP projects. And also includes patient assessment and evaluation data. So data in the electronic medical record is really internal evidence. Okay. Then we're back to the PICO question. I'm going to go just a little bit more or reiterate the elements of the PICO question displayed here on this slide, and then I will skip to a table. This table actually appears on page 40 of your textbook, and it gives you a little bit more information about what is meant by each of the elements. So you can refer to that as needed if you're unsure what you are looking for in an element of the PICO question. Okay, and then the purpose of the PICO question and the way they're written, the main purpose is that it focuses your systematic search for evidence, okay, and it maximizes how productive your search is for external evidence. So those are the main purposes of writing a PICO question. The elements are used to create a search strategy. And the better your PICO question is written, the more theoretically more productive and efficient your search strategy is going to be. And we'll go more into PICO questions as we get into the chapter 2 content. So objective 6 for module 1 is to differentiate clinical questions from quality improvement and research questions. And these are very closely related to the differences between those activities that we just reviewed in the previous table that I put up there for you. The textbook chapter has a nice table in it on page 42 that shows you the differences between research, quality improvement, and those sorts of questions that you might ask. Research, the main difference between a research question and a QI or a clinical question is that research questions are always aimed at finding out what is not known. So research has to be done to generate new evidence to answer the research question, whereas the clinical questions and quality improvement questions can be answered with internal evidence or external evidence that already exists. Okay. And objective 7 is to differentiate background questions from foreground questions. This is pretty key information here because it's something that students struggle with one aspect of the project proposal and one of the assignments that you're going to do for this class. So background questions are sort of general, they're broader questions than foreground questions. And foreground questions are basically the same thing as a PICO question. This table, you can find that in your textbook on page 39, kind of compares the two. Then I'm just going to elaborate a bit on background questions. Background questions are questions about the clinical problem or issue. And they tend to have two components. One is the what, where, when, why, and how component, and then another relates to the outcome of interest. So they're broader than foreground or PICO questions, and they might be related to the physiology of how a treatment or an intervention resolves a problem. So they're really, I tend to think of background questions as things that are more about the problem itself or how the mechanism behind how a particular intervention might solve that problem, whereas foreground questions are more specifically about they're about finding the evidence that's needed to answer the question. Now for this class, a background question also relates to the practice problem. So to answer a background question, you need to know what the problem is, the basic definition of the problem in its general context beyond the practice setting, who it affects in general beyond the practice setting, and how frequent and or prevalent the problem is, and what are its consequences. So, so let's say that you had a PICO question that was related to managing anxiety in patients who have suffered myocardial infarction. Okay, so the background problem, it could be twofold. It could be anxiety, but the fundamental problem that is probably contributing to the anxiety is the fact that patients have had a myocardial infarction. And so you would want to delve into the problem of myocardial infarction as having resulted from coronary artery disease, and you would elaborate on who it affects, how frequent and prevalent coronary artery disease is, how often myocardial infarction occurs as a result of coronary artery disease, and what the consequences are of having coronary artery disease and a myocardial infarction. Those would help you describe the problem in its general context. And that's something that you're going to be asked to do for one of the first major assignments in the class, which is the problem introduction assignment. And you'll find that when you start working on the graduate project proposal, there's two problems you're going to describe. You're going to describe the problem in its general context, and then you're also going to describe the practice problem, which is the problem in the actual specific practice setting where you would possibly make a practice change, and you would design your project proposal around that particular setting. Okay, so the problem introduction is an introduction of the problem in its general context beyond the practice setting. Okay. So the foreground questions, as I said, are just PICO questions. They're questions about diagnosing, treating, or educating patients. They're also about predicting or prognosis, and they can also be about meaning. They are answered with external evidence. Okay, and the focus is on specific knowledge. Using that PICO format makes it easier to find the evidence to answer the foreground question when you conduct a literature search. So it makes your literature search more efficient and productive. So that's why PICO questions are so important. Okay, now these are different types of PICO or foreground questions that you could ask. You can have intervention questions that relate to actual treatments or things that you could do to resolve a practice problem. Then there's prognosis and prediction questions that ask what's going to happen to a group of people that were exposed to a particular toxic substance, or maybe a healthy activity going forward. What sort of outcomes are predicted by that exposure? And diagnostic questions actually relate to diagnostic tests, what most accurately diagnoses the outcome. Then etiology questions are sort of related to why something happens, why a condition occurs, why it's associated with a particular outcome. And then meaning questions are very broad. They're more asking about patient experiences and how that influences an outcome, or the scope or the range of the problem or phenomenon that's of interest. Okay, now there's actually a template for each of those types of background or PICO questions, and those are provided in your textbook, and I'm going to summarize them in this presentation.